As we continue with our series, Giving God's Way, so far we've looked at number one, how we should feel about money or our attitude towards it. Number two, how we should earn our money honestly. Number three, how we should spend our money as good stewards. And for the past couple of weeks, number four, we have begun to look at how we should give our money. You'll remember that we can divide the history of giving into three sections. Before the time of Moses, or from creation to Moses. Second, from Moses until Jesus, or the period of the Old Testament law. And then from Jesus to our present day, our present time. Now we need to understand and remember as well that in all three periods of history, giving falls into two categories. And these two categories are what we call free will giving and required giving. Free will giving and required giving. In our time together last week, we looked at the first period of history from creation until Moses, and we unpacked examples of these two types or categories of giving. Well, today, I want us to pick up with the second period of history from Moses to Jesus. And this period, as I said, covers the time of what is called the Mosaic Law or the Law of Moses until Jesus came. And it's during this period that the word tithe becomes a very familiar term. And those who teach tithing as God's universal principle of giving rely almost exclusively on this period of Old Testament history that we're going to look at today for their justification of tithing within the New Testament church, which again is from the time of Jesus to our present day. Now, in our time together, I want us to look at the giving which was required during this second period of history from Moses to Jesus. We're not looking at the free will giving today, but we're going to focus on that which was actually required that they had to give. Now, keep in mind that in all three periods of history, it speaks, as I said, of both required and free will giving. These three periods of history are three separate or distinct periods, and in all three of them, the same pattern of giving is taught and practiced. There is no difference. Now, as we've already established, the word tithe or tithing is nothing more than a mathematical term. It's not really a biblical term. It's a mathematical term which means to give a tenth, and this is what Israel gave. In understanding the purpose of the tithe, we need to first of all turn to Leviticus chapter 27. Now, what's being described here was the tithe called the Lord's tithe or the Levites' tithe. And the reason it was called the Levites' tithe is because it tells us in Numbers chapter 18 that this tithe was collected to be given to the Levites. Now, the question is, who were the Levites? Well, these were the priest, the entire tribe of Levi. And the tithe, or we would call it really a taxation, went to supply the needs of the Levites, who were one of the 12 tribes of Israel. You see, they were the priestly tribe within the nation of Israel. So this is what was called the Levites' tithe in verse 30. And it says this: a tithe of everything from the land, whether grain from the soil or fruit from the trees, belongs to the Lord. It is holy to the Lord. In other words, a tenth of it isn't even yours. 10% of all your land and your seeds and fruit is the Lord. Now let's say that maybe you wanted to keep your fruit. And so we're told in verse 31, whoever would redeem any of their tithe must add a fifth of the value to it. So if you want to keep your 10%, for example, of fruit, you can pay for it instead by adding 20% and give money in place of the fruit. So in a sense, you doubled it. Now concerning the tithe of the herd or the flock or your animals, which literally meant a tenth of every calf and a tenth of every lamb, verse 32 says this: every tithe of the herd and flock, every 10th animal that passes under the shepherd's rod will be holy to the Lord. In other words, you could give money in exchange for the land and the seed and the fruit, but you could not redeem or buy back the animals that you owed to the Lord in tithe. When it came to the animals of your herd or your flock, you had to give them to the Lord. In fact, the very last part of verse 33 says, it cannot be redeemed, referring to the animals of your herd or your flock. And in verse 34, we read, these are the commands of the Lord that he gave Moses at Mount Sinai for the Israelites. You see, the Levites' portion was the tithe, which was 10% given by all the other 11 tribes of Israel from everything they owned in terms of their produce, from their land and their animals. Now we need to understand that the emphasis here is on quantity. You see, the tithe of the other 11 tribes was God's way of providing for the needs of the Levites, who were the priestly tribe and provided spiritual or priestly ministry for the rest of the nation of Israel, the entire nation. The other 11 tribes, you'll remember, received a land inheritance when they went into the promised land, the land of Canaan, when they entered, all except for the tribe of Levi. You see, the Levites were scattered throughout the nation of Israel because of their priestly role or ministry in serving as spiritual leaders to the people of Israel. Now, what this teaches us is that this tithe or the tenth belonged to God. This is not a free will offering to the Lord. God is saying to the Israelites that this is his already, and they were robbing him if they did not give it to him. So the 10% or tithe given to the tribe of Levi was given for the purpose to support them because they were the priest and couldn't earn a living. Why? Because they carried out all of these priestly functions for the worship of God in the Old Testament. And so these things that were given went to support them in place or in lieu of their ability to earn a living. Because as spiritual leaders, they literally ran the government for the nation of Israel. You see, the Levites ran the nation because Israel was what we call a theocracy, not a democracy, but a theocracy. And this means that they were directly ruled by God himself. The Greek word is theos for God. So it was a theocracy, the direct rule of God. Now, some of you are saying, but, well, Steve, there it is, right there. There's the 10%. So we should all give 10% even today. Well, just hold on for a second. Let me show you something else that we find in Deuteronomy chapter 12. You see, in Deuteronomy 12, we find that there was a second tithe. And we see it in verses 5 through 17. Yes, this is another required tithe, an additional 10%. And this 10% was to be taken to Jerusalem. And it was to be eaten. It was to be eaten by the family, the friends, the servants, and the priest in the sanctuary. And the idea of it was to stimulate devotion to the Lord on the part of the people, to promote unity in the family and the servants. And they would all go to Jerusalem. They would consume this particular tithe together. It was kind of like a national potluck that made everybody share with one another. And it's recorded for us in the 12th chapter of Deuteronomy. I want to share with you some selected verses beginning in verse 5. Just bear with me as I share this. But you are to seek the place the Lord your God will choose from among all your tribes to put his name there for his dwelling. To that place you must go. There bring your burnt offerings and sacrifices, your tithes and special gifts, what you have vowed to give, and even your freewill offerings, and the firstborn of your herds and flocks. There in the presence of the Lord your God, you and your family shall eat and shall rejoice in everything you have put your hand to, because the Lord your God has blessed you. And there rejoice before the Lord your God, you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, and the Levites from your towns, who have no allotment or inheritance of their own. Be careful not to sacrifice your burnt offerings anywhere you please. Offer them only at the place the Lord will choose in one of your tribes, and there observe everything I command you. You must not eat in your own towns the tithe of your grain and your new wine and olive oil, or the firstborn of your herds and flocks, or whatever you have vowed to give, or your free will offerings or special gifts. So already, think about this. With these two tithes we've looked at, they are now up to 20% in required giving in the Old Testament. You've got 10% that they had to give to the government or the Levites, the priestly tribe, in order to supply food and sustenance for them. And this was called, again, the Levites' tithe. Second, as we just read, there was the festival tithe, a national potluck to be eaten in Jerusalem to celebrate God's goodness and to promote fellowship among the people. But you know what? That's not all. In Deuteronomy chapter 14, just a little further on, we find that there's a third tithe. That's true, a third tithe. In verse 28, it says this: at the end of every 3 years, bring all the tithes of that year's produce and store it in your towns. And then it says, according to verse 29, this was so that the Levites who have no allotment or inheritance of their own, and the foreigners, the fatherless, and the widows who live in your towns may come and eat and be satisfied, and so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. Now, this third tithe was what was called the poor tithe. The first one was called the Levites' tithe. The second one was called the festival tithe. And this third one that we just looked at was called the poor tithe. The difference was it was to be observed every third year. Not every year, but every third year. So think about this. Every year you've got 10% plus a second 10%. And on top of that, you could add 3 1/3% for this poor tithe. If you divide that 10% or that third tithe by 3, since it was to be observed every third year. So take the tithe, the 10%, divide it by every third year, and apply it to each year. And yes, you're now up to 23% a year right now of required giving if you're an Israelite living in the time of Moses and Jesus, or rather in the time between Moses and Jesus, from the time of the Old Testament law. A quarter of their income every year was required to be given under Old Testament tithing. Think about it. a quarter of their income. So when somebody comes along and says that the Jews only gave 10%, that's totally wrong. It isn't true. They gave 23% annually to begin with. That's not all. And coincidentally, this third tithe, the poor tithe, was what we would call today the welfare program. This was for the poor people in Israel, the widows and the orphans and the people who didn't have anything to eat. This was God's welfare program to provide for the poor. So you can see what the people of Israel were doing. They were funding the people who ran the government, the Levites' tithe. They were supplying for a national religious feast in the festival tithe. And the third one was the welfare program, or the poor tithe. You see, this all required funding on the part of the people for the national entity, the nation of Israel. And all three of those required tithes are really taxation. They are not free will giving to God. These were required of the Jewish people and were not optional. So you see, tithing under the law of Moses was always taxation, so that the programs of the government of Israel, as defined by God, could function and run. The priestly program, the national religious or festival program, and the welfare program. But guess what? We're still not done. You see, if you were a Jew, you still weren't done. In Leviticus chapter 19, which is the profit sharing plan in Israel, this is what it says in verses 9 and 10. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time, or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. Now get this. God says when you reap your harvest in the fields, leave the edges or the corners alone. Don't pick up what you drop. Why? Because I want you to leave it for the poor. And then he says, I am the Lord your God, right at the very end of that verse. You know what that is? That's like him saying, and I'm not kidding, this is what I expect and this is what you're to do. So here was profit sharing. You didn't pick up what you dropped, and you left the corners of the field unharvested. Why? So that the poor people could share in that. So now God is saying you're required to literally leave money laying in the field, in the corners of your field, so the poor can pick it up and they can take it and they can literally sell it or whatever and share in your profit. Now the people of Israel also had a third of a shekel temple tax, because they had to pay to buy what was called the showbread for the tabernacle, and the grain and the sacrifices for the temple. They paid for what was used in the temple worship, in the tabernacle worship. And if you want more, in Exodus chapter 23, they had to have a Sabbath rest for the land every 7 years. That's right. You know what this meant? This meant that they forfeited an entire year's earning off their land to give the land rest. They had to let it rest. Literally, every 7th year, they did not farm the land. They had to let it rest. And in addition, on the same Sabbath year, every 7th year that they did that, they had to set all of their debts aside. They literally had to release those who owed money to them of their debt. Now, folks, 10% is a long way from what it actually cost them to give the Lord in this period between Moses and Jesus under the Old Testament law. They were easily well over 25% of their income in required giving to God. And we need to understand that this was required giving. It was a requirement in their worship and in their obedience to God. This has nothing to do with their free will offerings or givings, of which we're going to talk about in our time together next week. We will focus on even the free will giving that took place during this second period of history between Moses and Jesus under the Old Testament law. So don't be fooled when somebody tells you they only gave 10%. No, they were giving easily well over 25% of their income during this time between Moses and Jesus. It's interesting, isn't it, when you begin to study the scripture and you find out that in the Old Testament, they gave sacrificially. God expected them to give, He required them to give, and the people gave to Him sacrificially. Well, we're going to continue with our studies. As I said, next week we'll unpack more about this second period of history. Thanks again for being with me today.